Hello students, in this video lecture we talk about how taxes on goods and services affect market outcomes. In the previous video lecture we looked at the effect of price controls on market outcomes. Now we want to do the same thing with taxes on goods and services, and in particular we are interested in knowing whether the effects depend on whether the tax is directly imposed on buyers or when it is imposed on sellers. And also we want to know who shares the highest burden of the tax, right? Whether consumers or producers, something that we call tax incidence. We know government must raise revenues in order to pay for public projects like roads, schools, and national defense. And one way that the governments raise revenues is by taxing goods and services. And these taxes on goods and services could be a tax directly on buyers, like a sales tax. So we make a payment and whenever we buy something, we have to make a payment as a buyer, or it could be directly on sellers. So a government can say for each unit of output that you produce, you must pay this much. And those taxes could be on a per unit basis or on an ad valorem basis, which would be a percentage of the price of the good, like would be a sales tax. And one thing that we want to analyze is what we call the tax incidence, and that is we want to know the manner in which the burden of the tax is shared among the market participants, whether on buyers or on sellers. And we're going to learn some useful surprises here. So let's get to a concrete example. Let's think about the market for pizza. Whenever we're making market analysis, we start this way. We have the supply for pizza and we have the demand for pizza. And here, an equilibrium without a tax is pretty much what we have been analyzing so far. We see that the market price is $10 per pizza and the equilibrium quantities is 500 pizzas. Now let's analyze the effect of a $1.50 per unit on this market. So suppose that the government comes in and it enacts a law where pizza restaurants have to pay $1.50 for each pizza that they sell. Okay, so how does this affect the supply and demand diagram here? Well, this directly affects the supply side of the market because it will directly affect the decisions of firms. Now firms have to pay the tax to the government. So how would it affect the supply side of the market? It would shift the supply curve by exactly the $1.50. It will shift it up by the exact amount of the $1.50. So the intuition here is pretty straightforward. So for the pizza restaurants to be willing to produce those 500 pizzas that they were willing to produce before the tax, then they would have to raise the price per pizza by $1.50 to compensate for the additional cost of this tax. Yes? Okay? So that's what would happen. So that would happen for each quantity. Now they would be willing to supply the same quantities if the price was higher by $1.50. But pizza restaurants won't be able to increase the price by the $1.50. Why? Because consumers will respond to this increase in price. That is, the law of demand applies. Yes? So pretty much the way to show that is with this increase in the supply, now this is the relevant supply curve, and the new intersection between the demand curve and the new supply curve, that determines the new equilibrium. Okay? So again, firms cannot pass along the full amount of the tax. Why? Because as prices go up, quantities demanded fall according to the law of demand. So that's going to take us to a new equilibrium, which is this new equilibrium here. Okay, that shows us the response of consumers due to that change in the supply curve. So at the new equilibrium of 450 pizzas that get sold, there's going to be an equilibrium price that buyers pay of $11. Okay. What is the amount that what is the amount that sellers get? Well, they charge $11, but they must pay $1.50 to the government. So the $11 minus the $1.50, that's the $9.50 price per unit that sellers receive. So you see here, the effect of the tax is that number one, it reduces the quantities in equilibrium to a lower amount. So that's bad both for consumers and for restaurants, for sellers here. And it increases the price from $10 to $11 and reduces the price from $10 to $9.50. should be more careful. It increases the price that buyers pay from $10 to $1, and it decreases the price per unit that the firms receive from $10 to $9.50. That difference between what buyers pay and what sellers receive per unit, that is the $1.50 of the tax, right? So the government is going to tax by this amount of those 450 pizzas. So you see, it is not surprising to see that the price that buyers pay get higher, okay? But I think that it is surprising to see that the price goes up, but not by the exact amount of the tax. It goes up by a lower amount. Why? Again, because the law of demand. As prices go up, consumers respond by reducing the quantities demanded. And that would be shown as a movement along the initial equilibrium here to the new equilibrium over here. Okay? And a second surprising thing is that some students might not have expected is that the price per unit that the firms receive, in this case the restaurants, it gets dropped from $10 to $9.50. So you see, this analysis of supply and demand, it shows us that the burden of the tax is shared between buyers and sellers, right? So buyers pay more, sellers get less. It's a lose-lose, okay? Everybody loses, and the equilibrium quantities, they fall. Now let's consider the effect of a tax on buyers. So it is a tax that buyers have to pay directly at the time of purchase, right? And let's consider a tax on $1.50. Since it's a tax on buyers, then this will directly affect the demand side of the market. It will directly affect the demand curve. How will it affect the demand curve? Well, it's going to shift the demand curve, okay? It's going to shift it down in a parallel motion by exactly the amount of the tax. And the interpretation here, again, it should be straightforward. So what we have is that to get consumers to buy those 500 quantities, then the price per pizza must fall to $8.50, such that when we add the tax, we are again back to paying out of pocket $10. Okay, $10 is what gets us consumers to buy those 500 pizzas. All right, and that would be true for any quantity in the market. So the price per pizza must fall by exactly $1.50 in order to get us to buy the same quantities at each price level. So we can show that as a shift down of the demand curve by exactly $8.50. All right. That gets us to a new equilibrium given by the new demand curve and the supply curve, a new equilibrium of 450 units. So if you do this carefully, this shift down would get us to the exact same new equilibrium of of 450 pizzas. All right, and this gives us to an equilibrium price of pizza. This is the price that sellers receive per pizza of $9.50. But consumers, how much do we pay? We pay the price per pizza of $9.50 plus the tax of $1.50, which gets us to a price that we pay of $11. Okay? Now this is including the tax. So as you can see, the result is exactly the same. When the tax is paid directly by buyers, so when the law is written that buyers have to pay for it directly, or when the law is written that it is the restaurants or firms, sellers, that have to pay the tax directly, it has no different effect on the equilibrium prices and quantities. It has exactly the same effect. And if you come to think about it, now at this point, it should not be a surprise, because at the end of the day, the only difference between the tax paid by sellers versus the tax paid by buyers is whether the receipt basically shows the tax. Yes, when the buyer pays a tax, then pretty much you would have to have in the receipt the price of the item plus the tax. Yes, if it is a tax that sellers receive, then the law would be written in a way that that producers, sellers cannot include that in the tax. I'm sorry, they could not include that in the price. That's the only difference. So although initially, if you think about it, a tax on buyers, you would expect that the price increase should be higher than if it was a tax on sellers. But when you think about it more carefully, yeah, it shouldn't make any big difference. At the end of the day, it's a difference in the receipt. And again, notice the difference. There's a increase in the price that buyers pay of $1. There's a decrease in the price per pizza that sellers receive of 50 cents. So that $1.50 tax, it's split $1 of a higher price per unit paid by buyers and 50 cents per unit that sellers do not receive. So we say that this is the tax incidence. This is the burden of the tax on consumers and the burden of the tax on sellers. Consumers have a burden of $1, they get to pay $1 more, and sellers have a burden of the tax that is 50 cents. They get 50 cents less with the tax than before. Since the outcome of the prices that buyers and sellers pay is the same in both scenarios, then it's a better approach to think about issues related to taxes on goods and services as a wedge between the supply curve and the demand curve. So rather than making the graph messy with one more line in either direction, since it doesn't matter which one is the one that we're shifting as long as we shift it correctly, then why bother by doing that, right? It's better to do what we call the wedge approach. Okay, so the tax is going to drive a wedge between the demand curve and the supply curve. So think about a stick like this bright green stick right here that is perfectly straight, and has a length of $1.50. We want to insert that stick as much as we can between the supply and the demand, such that it continues to be straight. All right, so this stick doesn't go any further in to the right than what is shown there. Yes, and if it's placed anywhere to the left, it's not quite fitted in. It is exactly at this point right here, driving a wedge of $1.50 between the demand and the supply curve. At that point, it's going to get us to the new equilibrium quantities of 450, and right there we can see the effect of the increase of the price that buyers pay and the decrease of the price per unit that sellers get. All right, and the difference, of course, is the tax collection per unit. So whenever analyzing situations related to taxes on goods and services, it is simpler to graphically think about a wedge that you insert between the supply and the demand curve, and that's it. Don't bother with shifting the supply and the demand curve. This would do. Okay, now is your time to shine. I want you to evaluate the effects of a tax on the market for hotel rooms. All right, so what I want you to do is to find the new equilibrium quantities, the price that buyers pay, and the price that sellers receive per unit, and also to tell me a comment about the incidence of the tax when there is a tax of $30 per room. All right, and here it says that the tax is imposed on buyers, but we already learned that that does not matter. But whether it's on buyers or on sellers, is going to drive a wedge between the supply and the demand curve of $30. So hit the pause button, think about this, write your answers, and come back to compare answers. Okay, so here's the answer. So what you want to do is you want to fit in a wedge of a straight line between the supply and the demand curve that is equal to $30. So if you visualize it, there's a stick that has this length of $30 that could not go any further in than here, and anywhere to the left, well, it wouldn't be a snug fit, right? So the wedge that is going to be driven is a wedge between $110 that buyers will pay and a price per hotel room of $80 per night, right? And the equilibrium quantities here are going to be 80. So there's a drop in the equilibrium quantities from 100 to $80. So what is the incidence of the tax or the burden of the tax? Well, this $30 tax per hotel room, buyers pay $10 and sellers, they pay $20. Notice that this is different. The share of the burden of the tax is different than in the previous example of the pizzas, right? So here we see that sellers are worse off than buyers, yes? Whereas in the pizza, the buyers were worse off than the sellers, relatively speaking, right? They are both worse off than before the tax. But in the pizza case, buyers pay more of the burden of the tax than sellers. In this example, we see that sellers pay more of the burden of the tax, right? So these conclusions is going to depend on, guess what? The price elasticities of demand and supply respectively, yes? And that's something that we explore next. Okay, so let's now explore the connection between the price elasticity of demand and supply and the tax incidence. So this would be the equilibrium price in a market with no tax. And notice from this diagram that what we have here, it's a demand curve that is almost perfectly vertical, right? Or at least it's more vertical than the supply curve. The supply curve is relatively more flatter than the demand curve, yes? And now let's think about the effect of a tax. Remember, the tax creates a wedge between the demand and the supply. And in this situation, this is the price that buyers pay, and this is the price that sellers would get per unit. All right. And with this situation, we can see that the buyer's share of the tax burden is lower than the seller's share of the tax burden. All right. And this is something that we would always see when the supply is more elastic than the demand. So this is always going to depend on the relative elasticities. And when supply is more elastic than the demand, then buyer's share of the tax burden is going to be higher than the seller's share of the tax burden. Why? Well, think about it. Since the supply is more elastic than the demand, then sellers are more able to respond to the price drop, right? So they will not have to suck in that price drop as much as consumers that have a less elastic demand curve. Yes. So whenever we have this situation when supply is more elastic than demand, then buyers will pay a higher share of the tax burden than sellers. Now let's look at a different case. Now the demand is more elastic than the supply. So look at this carefully so that you can see that. Yes. So demand is relatively flatter than the supply is. All right. So as we know, if there is a tax of this amount, it creates a wedge between demand and supply. And what we have here is we see that the price that buyers pay is this amount, the price per unit that sellers get is this amount. And you can see, compared to the situation without the tax, the buyer's share of the tax burden is lower than the seller's share of the tax burden. All right? And that's something that we will always observe when the demand is more elastic than the supply. And the intuition here is that since demand is more elastic, remember what that implies is that the quantities demanded are more responsive to changes in prices. So when the prices increase for the demand side, consumers are more responsive. They are more able to reduce the quantities demanded that suppliers are. And therefore, they will not have to suck in that price increase as much as sellers will have to. Okay? This will always happen when demand is more elastic. So you should go back and forth between this slide and the previous slide so that you can really see the differences between case 1 and case 2. At the end of the day, the takeaway is, and the thing to memorize if you're a person that likes memorizing things, is that the side of the market that have the more elastic curve is going to share a lower burden of the tax. All right, the side of the market that has a more elastic curve is going to pay a lower share of the burden of the tax. Consider this: who pays the luxury tax? So in 1990, Congress adopted a new luxury tax. And this is a tax on yachts, private airplanes, and other expensive items that are considered to be luxury goods. And of course, the goal is to raise revenue in a way that it affects people who can afford it more, right? So private airplanes, jewelry, and yachts, that's something that only the wealthiest people can buy. So when we have luxury items, we would expect the demand to be quite elastic. Yes, by definitions, that's what we have. The more luxurious a good is, that is, the less of a necessity it is, we consider the demand to be more elastic. And we would consider that the supply to be relatively less elastic than the demand. So it would be relatively inelastic, right? I mean, and the key word here, it's relatively speaking. We would expect demand to be relatively more elastic than the supply. So we can analyze the effect of the luxury tax on the market for yachts. That's definitely a luxury good. The way that I've drawn it here, it's key to draw it correctly, and you have to pay attention because sometimes it's not that clear. But if you draw a straight line that goes perfectly vertical here through the intersection, you can see that the supply curve, it's more vertical than the demand curve, right? So the supply curve, it's less elastic than the demand. All right, so the consequence of here, for a tax of some amount, it creates a wedge between the price that buyers pay and the price that sellers get. The way to do it correctly would have to be like this. Here you have to be careful about the way that you draw it. You would have to draw the demand curve relatively flatter than the supply curve in order to get this right. Yes, because again, for luxury goods, we expect the price elasticity of demand to be larger, and for the supply side, at least in the short run, we would consider that it is more inelastic. So under these situations, drawing it carefully, we can see that the buyer's share of the tax burden is lower than the seller's share of the tax burden. So producers of yachts are going to be affected worse than the buyers of the yachts. So if this is a tax that is meant to be paid by those that can afford it more, it's not doing a great job, right? Because if it is consumers that have higher incomes, the ones who buy the yachts, they're not necessarily, at least not relatively speaking, they're not paying most of that tax. It is producers of yachts who are paying that tax. Here's an interesting application of elasticities and the effect of taxes. So think about the Social Security payroll tax, right? So those of you who have worked before, then you are used to seeing a pay stub that shows some subtraction from Social Security contributions, right? Social Security is the public retirement system in the United States. So the way that it works in the United States is that the worker has to pay, or must have subtracted 6.2% from their payment, and employers are supposed to contribute an equal amount to the Social Security system. All right, but in 2011, there was a reduction in the portion that workers have to pay towards Social Security as a measure of the government to stimulate the economy. So in 2010, still the economy was slowly recovering, so this was an effort to induce a stimulus for the economy. So the payroll tax, or the workers' contribution of the payroll tax, was reduced from 6.2% to 4.2%. So it's a reduction of 2 percentage points, where the employer's portion was left at 6.2%. So it was not reduced. So here's a thought experiment. Here's a question. Should this change have increased the typical worker's take-home pay by exactly 2%, more than 2%, or less than 2%? And do any elasticities would affect your answer? A follow-up question would be, who gets the bigger share of this tax cut, workers or employers? And whether the elasticities determine the answer. So think about this one carefully before looking at the answers. Hit the pause button, read it carefully, do some drawings. Consider, let me give you a hint, elasticities do matter for the second question. And so, yes, come up with your own answers and then come back. Here are the answers. As long as the labor supply and the labor demand have some price elasticities, the tax cut will be shared by both workers and employers. Why? Remember that the incidence of the tax is shared by both sides of the market, regardless of which side of the market the tax is imposed on. Yes, that's something that we observed at the very beginning of the video lecture. Okay, so that applies also for the tax cut. So the tax cut will be shared by both sides of the market. So if the tax cut is 2%, then the take-home pay of workers, at least in equilibrium, will rise less than the tax cut of 2%. And also notice that this feature, or this outcome, that the incidence of the tax is shared between both sides of the markets, do not depend on the elasticity, right? So the fact that they are shared does not depend on the elasticity. However, the size of the share, it will depend on the elasticities. That is actually true. And remember that the side of the market that has the most elasticity is going to have the lowest incidence of the tax. So the answer to this question, which side of the market is going to get the bigger share of this tax cut, it depends on the price elasticities of demand and supply, the relative price elasticities of demand and supply. So if labor demand is more elastic than labor supply, then workers would get more of the tax cut than employers. Remember that the side of the market that is more elastic has a lower incidence of the tax. So in this case, if the demand side of the market it's more elastic, then the tax cut, the impact of the tax cut is going to be smaller, right? And it is firms who demand labor. So firms are going to get less of the tax cut than workers if labor demand is more elastic than labor supply. And the converse is also true. If the labor demand is less elastic than the labor supply, then in that case, employers will get the larger share of the tax cut. So that brings us to what we learned earlier is that the incidence of the tax, it's higher for the side of the market that has the less elastic curve, okay? So when the demand is more elastic than supply, then the supply side of the market is going to have a higher tax incidence. So the tax cut is going to be enjoyed more by workers. But when the demand is less elastic than the supply, then employers are going to get the larger share of the incidence of the tax. They're going to get the larger share of the tax cut. Now this is a very interesting analysis because it's not obvious, right? And of course, all these outcomes and this tax incidence, it's in equilibrium. In the very short run, so in the next day after the enactment, then of course the full amount of the tax cut goes to workers. But when the market's clear, when we get to the new equilibrium, then the impact is going to be less than the 2%, and the share of the tax cut is going to depend on the price elasticities of demand and supply. So what did we learn? We learned that a tax on a good places a wedge between the price buyers pay and the price sellers receive, and causes the equilibrium quantity to fall. And this is regardless of whether the tax is imposed on buyers or sellers. And that's a very surprising result. The incidence of tax is the division of the burden of the tax between buyers and sellers, and it does not depend on whether the tax is imposed on buyers or sellers. However, the incidence of the tax does depend on the price elasticities of supply and demand. The side of the market that has the most inelastic curve is going to have the highest incidence of the tax. Okay, so this wraps up our discussion about what does taxes do on perfectly competitive markets. This government intervention, it creates a market distortion, right? So at the end of the day, there's less consumption, less production, buyers pay a higher price, sellers get a lower price, and that's bad for everyone, right? So this government intervention, it's a bad government intervention. However, of course, we know governments do need to raise revenues, okay? And this is one way that they do.